Picture this. You're standing ankle-deep in the bloody mud of a Scottish riverbank, watching enraged farmers physically tear an English nobleman to pieces. They aren't just killing him, they're skinning him. They hack strips of flesh from the corpse of Hugh de Cressingham, the king's treasurer, dragging their knives through the tissue to carve out makeshift sword belts. London officials promised they brought civilised law to the wild north. The reality saw garrison soldiers systematically stealing winter grain, leaving local children to freeze and pushing desperate peasants past the brink of human sanity. The Chronicle of Lanercost, an unfiltered monastic record, details this savage mutilation as a raw explosion of vengeance. Ordinary men rarely flay a royal official over abstract political ideals. They do it because their families are starving. What exact chain of financial extortion and brutal pushback triggered this catastrophic slaughter at the Battle of Stirling Bridge? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. King Edward I ran an aggressively expensive military empire. Constant campaigns across Wales and France completely emptied his vaults. He looked at Scotland and saw an endless supply of silver, wool and grain. After crushing the Scottish nobility at Dunbar in 1296, Edward forced the High Lords to sign the Ragman Rolls, a binding document demanding absolute submission. He then marched his main army south, leaving behind ruthless tax collectors to bleed the conquered land dry. Hugh de Cressingham led this financial siege. As a clergyman obsessed with wealth, he squeezed the local economy until it shattered. He seized livestock. He confiscated the harvest meant to sustain the villages through the brutal Highland winter. The Scottish aristocracy stayed perfectly quiet inside their castles, terrified of losing their lucrative English estates. The absolute crushing weight of the occupation slammed directly into the peasantry. Armed patrols took whatever they wanted, treating local families like disposable property. Hunger breeds radical violence. William Wallace did not step out of a romantic myth holding a shining banner of freedom. He started as a dangerous outlaw driven to the extreme. He struck first by breaking into the bedchamber of William de Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark, and hacking him to death in the middle of the night. That brutal assassination sent a massive shockwave across the country. Desperate men suddenly saw a crack in the invincible English armour. A scattered tax riot transformed overnight into a ruthless guerrilla war. Word of the assassinations and tax riots eventually reached London, interrupting King Edward I. Edward, known as Longshanks due to his terrifying height and ruthless temper, did not view this uprising as a war. He saw it as a minor police action, a nuisance. He was already deeply preoccupied with organising a major military campaign in Flanders and simply delegated the Scottish problem to his trusted lieutenant John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey. Warenne had crushed the Scottish nobility just a year earlier at the Battle of Dunbar. He was an ageing, wealthy veteran who absolutely detested the damp, miserable climate of the north. To him, William Wallace was not a military mastermind. He was a bandit, a common thief who needed to be hanged immediately so Warenne could return to the warm comforts of his English estates. Warenne assembled an extermination force. Medieval chronicles love to inflate troop numbers, but modern historians estimate he marched north with a highly professional army of around 10,000 infantry and several hundred heavy cavalry. That cavalry was the undisputed superweapon of the 13th century. Try to visualise a medieval heavy warhorse known as a destrier. This is not a modern racehorse. This is an aggressively bred, muscle-bound beast weighing close to 1,500 pounds, specifically trained to bite, kick, and trample human beings into the dirt. When fully armoured knights mounted these animals, they functioned like living, breathing tanks. They shattered infantry lines through pure, brutal kinetic energy. But super weapons come with a hidden catastrophic flaw. They require an astronomical amount of fuel. A single destrier needs massive quantities of high-quality oats and dry fodder every single day just to maintain its muscle mass. When you multiply that biological requirement by hundreds of horses, and add the daily bread, salted meat and ale needed for 10,000 marching foot soldiers, you create a logistical nightmare. The English army consumed supplies like a locust swarm. Moving this massive, hungry beast of an army through the Scottish landscape was an absolute nightmare. Scotland in the autumn is entirely unforgiving to heavy supply wagons. The dirt paths were virtually non-existent, reduced to deep, sucking mud by relentless rain. Every mile they advanced north stretched their supply chains thinner. Wagons bogged down up to their axles. Horses grew exhausted pulling them. The English forces heavily relied on a coastal fleet sailing alongside them to ship grain just to keep the men from starving before they even saw a battlefield. This immense logistical burden bred a dangerous psychological blindness in the English high command. They believed that because their army was so incredibly expensive, so heavily armoured, and so terrifying to look at, victory was a mathematical certainty. They assumed the starving Scottish peasants would simply drop their spears and scatter at the sight of the royal banners. Morayn's absolute confidence in his superior military machine blinded him to the one thing his massive army could not easily conquer: the treacherous geography of Scotland itself. If you have seen the movie Braveheart, you have a massive gap in your understanding of how Scotland actually won this war. Hollywood loves the image of a lone, wild-haired warrior standing against an empire, but history tells a much more tactical story. William Wallace was undoubtedly a force of nature, but he was not a one-man army. In the north, another leader was systematically dismantling the English occupation, Andrew Moray. While Wallace was conducting his guerrilla raids in the south, Moray had ignited his own uprising, sweeping through the castles and garrisons of northern Scotland with cold, calculated precision. These two men did not operate in a vacuum. By the time they met at Dundee, they had effectively split the English forces into two distinct zones of panic. Wallace brought the raw burning rage of the southern peasantry. Moray brought the disciplined command of a minor nobleman who understood how castles, supply lines, and feudal levies actually worked. When they joined forces, they didn't just pool their soldiers, they merged two different philosophies of resistance. Wallace provided the fire, but Moray provided the brain. Think about the sheer impossibility of what they were attempting. They were commanding an army of barely trained farmers, blacksmiths and low-born clansmen. These were not courier soldiers. They were men who had spent their entire lives under the thumb of local lords, never holding anything more lethal than a scythe or a wood axe. Yet Moray and Wallace managed to forge them into a cohesive fighting unit capable of standing against the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. They didn't win by charging into open fields. They won by forcing the English to fight on terms that completely neutralised their professional armour and experience. They knew the terrain intimately, using the deep forests and treacherous marshes of the Stirling region as a natural shield. While Warenne sat in his camp, overconfident and waiting for a formal chivalric showdown, Moray and Wallace were busy planning a trap. They weren't looking for a glorious battle. They were looking for a killing zone. They understood that the English army was an expensive, slow-moving predator, and they intended to lead that predator into a place where its weight would become its greatest enemy. By early September 1297, the brutal physical reality of the Scottish War of Independence slammed into the advancing English vanguard. Marching north had completely ceased to be a triumphant parade. The heavy autumn rains turned the meagre dirt tracks into a sprawling thigh-deep swamp. Those massive 1,500-pound destriers were burning through critical amounts of energy just trying to drag their hooves out of the muck. Thousands of infantrymen arrived at the banks of the River Forth exhausted, soaked to the bone, and carrying armour that felt twice as heavy as it did in London. They had finally reached the ultimate bottleneck of medieval Scotland, Stirling. Geography dictates destiny in warfare. If an invading army wanted to push into the Highlands to crush a rebellion, they absolutely had to cross the River Forth at this exact location. There was no sneaking around it. The river coiled through the flat valley like a dark snake, bordered by deep waterlogged peat bogs known locally as the Carse. To John de Warenne and the English High Command, Reaching this specific crossing point felt like the end of a miserable cold journey. They established a massive camp on the southern bank. Across the dark water, holding the high ground on a densely wooded volcanic outcrop called Abbey Craig, stood William Wallace, Andrew Moray, and a silent army of ordinary men. Try to view this standoff from the English command tent. Warenne possessed overwhelming numbers, steel armour, and decades of professional siege experience. The rebels were a makeshift militia armed with long, fire-hardened wooden spears. The English commander saw absolutely no reason to rush. He actually delayed the attack for several days. He assumed the sheer psychological weight of his sprawling military encampment, the thousands of campfires, the banners, the terrifying ranks of heavy horsemen, would easily break the peasants' nerve. He even sent 2 Dominican friars across the water to negotiate a surrender, casually offering royal pardons to anyone who threw down their weapons and went home. Warenne completely misread the situation. These rebels were not aristocratic lords playing political chess to protect their estates. They were desperate men fighting for their immediate physical survival. According to the chronicler Walter of Gisborough, Wallace sent the friars back with a chilling message that shattered any illusion of a peaceful resolution. He told the monks to return to their masters and tell them the Scots were not there to negotiate. They were there to fight, to prove their right to exist, and to violently punish the invaders. That absolute defiance forced Warenne's hand. The only way to engage the Scottish army was to cross the River Forth. The only viable path was Stirling Bridge itself. This was not a sturdy, modern stone structure. It was a narrow, rickety wooden span that could barely accommodate 2 horsemen riding side by side. Moving a massive heavy army across that tiny wooden plank was a logistical nightmare that would take hours of slow, vulnerable movement. As the sun broke through the clouds on the 11th of September, the English vanguard prepared to cross, completely blind to the fact that Wallace and Moray were watching their every move, waiting for the perfect moment to snap the trap shut. The geometry of Stirling Bridge was a death sentence disguised as a crossing. This wooden structure was incredibly narrow, barely wide enough for 2 horses to ride abreast. If you calculate the sheer physics of moving thousands of armoured men and skittish warhorses across this bottleneck, the absolute madness of the English plan becomes terrifyingly clear. At a cautious walk, factoring in the unstable wooden planks and the natural hesitance of heavy destriers over deep water, it would take the better part of a day just to get the vanguard to the northern bank. The English army was voluntarily dividing its own massive force, feeding its elite soldiers through a literal choke point, one slow, agonising trickle at a time. Up on Abbey Craig, William Wallace and Andrew Moray watched this mathematical disaster unfold with cold calculation. They had positioned their men perfectly. The rebel army was organised into schiltrons. Picture a massive, bristling hedgehog made of desperate men holding heavy 12-foot wooden spears. These tight infantry formations were specifically engineered to stop heavy cavalry dead in its tracks. A schiltron is incredibly effective, but it is primarily a defensive shield. It is slow to move and highly vulnerable to archers on open ground. The absolute brilliance of the Scottish strategy at Stirling was that Moray and Wallace never intended to fight on open ground. The looping bends of the River Forth and the deep muddy bogs created an artificial box. They turned the natural landscape into a walled arena where English numerical superiority meant absolutely nothing. Down on the southern bank, an argument had broken out among the English commanders. John de Warenne was hesitant. He actually understood the danger of the bridge and considered finding a safer ford further upstream. But Hugh de Cressingham, the arrogant royal treasurer who we met earlier, aggressively pushed for an immediate attack. Cressingham complained that delaying the battle was simply wasting the king's money. He cared more about the daily cost of feeding the army than the tactical reality of the terrain. Bullied by his own accountant, Warenne finally gave the order to cross. As the first English knights clattered onto the northern bank, they immediately found themselves trapped in a geographic pocket. The river loops tightly behind them, cutting off any chance of a rapid retreat. The soft, waterlogged earth beneath their hooves began to instantly sap their momentum. A medieval warhorse requires solid, dry ground to build up the terrifying speed needed for a full cavalry charge. In the deep mud of the Stirling cars, these massive beasts were reduced to a sluggish, exhausting trot. Warren sat safely on the southern bank, completely detached from the physical nightmare his vanguard was entering. He casually watched his men slowly cross the bridge, fully expecting the Scots to simply stand on the high ground and wait for the entire English force to assemble. That was the unwritten rule of aristocratic warfare. You formed your lines, you sounded the trumpets, and you engaged in a gentlemanly slaughter. Wallace and Moray had no interest in chivalry. They watched the northern bank slowly fill with heavy cavalry and infantry. They held their men back, waiting with terrifying discipline for the exact moment when the English vanguard reached the point of no return. William Wallace and Andrew Moray waited until roughly 5,000 English soldiers had crossed the timber bridge. This number was highly deliberate. It was exactly the amount of men the Scots could realistically slaughter in the confined space of the river loop, while still being a large enough force to permanently cripple the English war machine. Once that critical mass gathered on the northern bank, the trap snapped shut. Horns blared from the wooded heights of Abbey Craig. The Scottish army did not charge in a wild, chaotic mob as the English commanders expected. They advanced in tight, highly disciplined schiltron formations. Moving a massive block of spearmen over uneven ground requires intense drilling and absolute trust in the man standing right next to you. If the front line breaks, heavy cavalry will tear the entire unit apart in seconds. The Scots maintained their brutal, rigid formation. They became a creeping wall of 12-foot iron-tipped spears descending steadily toward the riverbank. The English vanguard suddenly realised they were completely cut off. The trapped cavalry desperately tried to organise a countercharge. This was their standard tactical response to any infantry threat across Europe. But a heavy warhorse needs open, hard ground to accelerate and deliver its devastating kinetic shock. Boxed in by the tight loop of the River Forth and sinking deep into the waterlogged peat, the horses could only manage a sluggish, exhausting canter. The physical impact between the two forces was catastrophic. When the English cavalry hit the schiltrons, it was not a glorious clash of steel. It was the horrific wet sound of 1,500-pound animals impaling themselves on thick ashwood shafts. The sheer momentum of the dying horses drove the spears deep into their chests, often snapping the wood and crushing the Scottish soldiers holding them. But the shield wall held firm. English knights were violently thrown from their saddles directly into the freezing mud. Once a heavily armoured man hit the soft ground, his expensive chainmail became a death trap. He was virtually immobile, easily overwhelmed by lightly armoured farmers wielding axes and long daggers. Absolute panic erupted. The English infantry trapped behind their own dying cavalry had absolutely nowhere to go. They were violently shoved backward. The crushing pressure of thousands of panicked men trying to retreat pushed hundreds of soldiers directly into the deep, fast-flowing water of the river. The heavy weight of their armour dragged them straight to the bottom before they could even attempt to swim. Simultaneously, a rapid detachment of Scottish spearmen executed the most critical manoeuvre of the battle. They sprinted around the chaotic flank of the collapsing vanguard and violently seized the northern end of Stirling Bridge. They physically barricaded the only exit. The choke point was entirely sealed. Half of the English army was now locked inside a muddy slaughterhouse, while the other half stood helplessly on the opposite bank. The northern bank of the River Forth dissolved into an absolute massacre. The enclosed geographic pocket left the trapped English vanguard with zero room to manoeuvre. Scottish spearmen systematically pushed the surviving cavalry and infantry into the freezing deep water. Men weighed down by 60 pounds of steel armour sank immediately. Those who managed to stay on land were pulled from their exhausted horses and killed in the thick mud. The fearsome English war machine simply ceased to exist in that tight, bloody space. Among the dying was Hugh de Cressingham. The arrogant royal treasurer who had rushed the attack to save King Edward a few pennies on daily rations found himself entirely bogged down. He fell from his heavy warhorse into the swampy earth. The Scottish fighters recognised him immediately. He was the living embodiment of the brutal taxation and starvation they had endured. They did not take him prisoner for ransom, which was the standard chivalric practice of the time. They butchered him. And as we visualised at the very beginning of this story, the enraged rebels stripped his armour, flayed his body and carved his skin into strips to use as belts for their swords. That macabre act was the ultimate punctuation mark on a terrifying morning. Across the water on the southern bank, John de Warenne watched the impossible happen. He stood surrounded by thousands of fresh, heavily armed soldiers. They vastly outnumbered the Scottish forces. Yet, they were completely paralysed. The narrow wooden bridge was solidly blocked by dead bodies, panicked horses, and advancing Scottish spearmen. Warenne realised his elite vanguard was being entirely wiped out, and the rebels now controlled the crossing. Panic completely shattered the English command. Warenne possessed enough infantry to hold the southern bank indefinitely, or he could have marched upstream to find another ford. He chose the path of absolute cowardice. To ensure Wallace and Moray could not cross the river and pursue him, Warenne ordered his own men to destroy the Stirling Bridge. They hacked away the wooden supports and set the structure on fire. By breaking the bridge, the English general intentionally condemned any remaining survivors on the northern bank to death. Once the timbers collapsed into the river, Warenne turned his horse and fled. He rode with terrifying speed away from the battlefield. He did not stop to rally his retreating forces. He rode straight for the border town of Berwick, effectively abandoning his entire northern campaign in a single, humiliating afternoon. Behind him, the River Forth choked on the corpses of over 100 elite knights and thousands of foot soldiers. The untouchable English Empire had just suffered one of the most devastating and financially catastrophic defeats in its medieval history. The waters of the River Forth eventually ran clear, but the political landscape of Britain was permanently altered by what happened that September morning. The Scottish victory was absolute and highly lucrative. By wiping out the English vanguard and forcing Warenne to flee, the rebels captured the massive English supply train. They effectively armed and fed their starving rebellion in a single stroke. Looting the dead provided thousands of high-quality steel swords, expensive mail shirts, and desperately needed winter clothing. William Wallace, the ruthless outlaw who had started this uprising by assassinating a local sheriff in the dark, suddenly found himself the undisputed master of Scotland. The high lords who had cowardly hidden in their estates while the peasantry bled at Stirling now rushed to align themselves with this victorious commoner, yet the triumph carried a devastating, deeply personal cost. Sometime during the chaotic, brutal melee at the bridge, Andrew Moray suffered a mortal wound. Historical records are frustratingly vague about the exact weapon or moment he fell. The grim reality of medieval medicine meant that even a minor puncture from a dirty iron spear often led to a slow, agonizing death from infection. For several weeks following the battle, official administrative documents were issued jointly in the names of both Moray and Wallace. Then, by late November, Moray's name simply vanished from the parchment. His death was a catastrophic strategic loss for the rebellion. Wallace possessed the fiery charisma necessary to inspire starving men to hold a shield wall against heavy cavalry. Moray possessed the cold, calculating intellect required to actually govern a fractured country. He understood the intricate web of aristocratic loyalties, the mathematics of siege warfare, and the vital importance of keeping supply lines open. With Moray gone, Wallace lost his political anchor. He was soon elevated to the title of Guardian of Scotland, a supreme position usually reserved for the absolute highest-ranking royalty. It was a massive public honour, but it immediately painted a target on his back. The Scottish nobility deeply resented being commanded by a man they viewed as an incredibly violent, low-born thug. They were perfectly happy to let Wallace do the bleeding at Stirling, but they absolutely hated taking his orders in the aftermath. Wallace was now forced to rule a country where his own generals secretly despised his bloodline. To keep his army fed and maintain his terrifying momentum, he immediately launched a brutal winter invasion of northern England. He burned towns across Northumberland and Cumberland, stripping the English countryside of livestock and grain to bring back to his devastated homeland. It was a vicious military necessity, but he was now operating entirely alone. Wallace found himself fighting a highly dangerous two-front war. He had to defend against a furious English empire actively preparing for revenge, while simultaneously watching his back against treacherous Scottish aristocrats waiting for his very first mistake. News of the bloody disaster at Stirling Bridge eventually reached King Edward I while he was actively campaigning in Flanders. A lesser monarch might have panicked at the absolute annihilation of his northern vanguard. Edward simply redirected his terrifying focus. He immediately negotiated a sudden truce with King Philip IV of France, packed up his royal household, and sailed straight back to England. The rebellion in Scotland had completely ceased to be a minor administrative annoyance. It was now a deep, personal insult to his authority. Edward was a man who answered political insults with overwhelming industrial violence. To understand the sheer scale of the English response, you have to look at the logistics of royal anger. Edward did not just raise a new army. He physically relocated the entire machinery of the English government. He moved the Exchequer and the Court of King's Bench from the safety of London all the way north to York. York instantly transformed into a massive forward operating base. The city flooded with weapons, wagons of grain, and thousands of newly recruited soldiers. Edward aggressively squeezed his remaining territories for every ounce of silver they possessed, nearly bankrupting his own kingdom to ensure this new military machine was fully funded. He was not planning a punitive raid. He was organising an absolute conquest. Edward was a brilliant, incredibly ruthless military tactician. He carefully analysed the failure at the River Forth. He recognised that sending expensive heavy cavalry to crash blindly into tightly packed schiltrons was a mathematical mistake. The Scottish spearmen had proven they could hold a rigid defensive line against a frontal cavalry charge. To break that wall of wood and steel, Edward needed a weapon that could kill from a distance, long before his armoured knights ever came within striking range of those 12-foot spears. He found his deadly solution in the rugged hills of Wales. Edward heavily recruited thousands of Welsh infantrymen equipped with the longbow. This was not a standard hunting weapon. A medieval warbow had a draw weight heavily exceeding 120 pounds. It required years of specialised physical training, often permanently warping the skeletal structure of the archers who used it. These men could drive heavy, iron-tipped bodkin arrows straight through chainmail armour at terrifying speeds. Edward realised that if he could use his cavalry to pin the static Scottish schiltrons in place, his Welsh archers could stand at a safe distance and simply rain armour-piercing arrows down upon them until the formations physically collapsed. William Wallace was desperately trying to solidify his newly won independence, but he was facing an entirely different kind of enemy now. He was no longer fighting the arrogant, lazy John de Warenne. He was facing the absolute full might of the English crown, commanded by a king who had spent his entire life studying the brutal mechanics of siege warfare. The crushing victory at Stirling Bridge had successfully given the Scots their freedom, but it also practically guaranteed the devastating massacre that was about to unfold. William Wallace did not live to see a free Scotland. The massive military retaliation King Edward organised at York eventually swept north, culminating in the horrific Battle of Falkirk just 10 months later. At Falkirk, the Welsh longbows performed exactly as the English king had predicted, tearing the static Scottish schiltrons to pieces. Wallace was forced back into hiding, eventually betrayed, and executed in London with terrifying cruelty. If you look purely at the immediate military timeline, the victory at the River Forth seems like a fleeting, ultimately futile moment of defiance. History is rarely dictated by immediate timelines. What happened at Stirling Bridge fundamentally changed the psychological landscape of the medieval world. Before that September morning, the English war machine was considered completely invincible. The royal court possessed the silver, the heavy cavalry, and the sprawling supply chains necessary to crush any peasant uprising. Andrew Moray and William Wallace proved that this apex predator could violently bleed. They demonstrated that the most expensive, highly developed military technology in Europe could be entirely neutralised by brilliant geographical positioning and raw human desperation. The sheer shock of hundreds of elite knights drowning in the mud permanently shattered the illusion of English supremacy. That broken illusion is exactly what allowed the Scottish resistance to survive the dark, brutal years that followed. Even though Edward won at Falkirk, the astronomical financial cost of constantly trying to subdue a highly motivated guerrilla-style insurgency eventually bankrupted his successors. When Robert the Bruce eventually took up the mantle of leadership, and finalise Scottish independence 17 years later at Bannockburn, he relied on the exact same fundamental principles. He used the Scottish land itself as a weapon against heavy armour. The Battle of Stirling Bridge remains one of the most brutal, tactically brilliant ambushes in military history. It was never a polite clash of romantic ideals. It was a vicious, desperate struggle over taxation, winter grain, and the fundamental right to exist without being bled dry by foreign administrators. It was the day ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and minor nobles looked at the most terrifying military force on earth and decided they would rather fight in the mud than kneel in the dirt. What do you think was the absolute most critical factor in this impossible victory? Was it the fiery leadership of Wallace, the cold tactical brilliance of the forgotten Andrew Moray, or simply the catastrophic arrogance of the English High Command? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see exactly how King Edward deployed his terrifying new weapons at the Battle of Falkirk, make sure you are subscribed. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next chapter of history.